Hello and welcome to another edition of The Front Page on GNAT TV. My name is Andrew McKeever, the managing editor of the Manchester Journal, and it's my pleasure to have with us in the studios of GNAT today two of our area state representatives to talk with us a little bit about what went on in the legislative session in Montpelier that adjourned a couple of weeks ago. With me here in the studio today is Patti Komline, who represents Dorset, Danby, Landgrove, Peru, and Mount Tabor, and also Charles Tim Goodwin, who represents Weston, Winhall, Jamaica, Stratton, and Londonderry. Tim, Patti, pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thanks for coming. Well, before we get started on talking a little bit about what the legislature did or didn't do this past session, there's one news event, Patti, I know that you are interested in and have been involved with that perhaps we could talk about first, and that's this whole question around Governor Peter Shumlin's attempt to acquire a parcel of property adjacent to his home in East Montpelier. You held a press conference a couple of weeks ago with one of your legislative colleagues where, shall we say, a little critical of the governor about the way he was going about this and also about some of the issues that were raised by it. And I just wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about that and why you find this a troubling situation.
Sure. I mean, the primary focus of the press conference was to address the issues around people who don't understand income sensitivity with regard to Act 6068. And what I did was I went to a couple town offices and checked to see if we have situations where people are delinquent in paying their property tax and may qualify for income sensitivity but have not filled out the paperwork. Because while the tax office thinks it's easy to do, it's actually quite complicated for people. And indeed, both towns I stopped in said yes, they do have, somebody actually owes $40,000 in back taxes, and they said they're pretty sure that they would qualify for income sensitivity. So we came up with kind of a simple solution to address this issue, and that was what the press conference was about, that, and also just about people who neglect to check off the right boxes for their homestead declarations and find while they've been getting the income sensitivity prebates every year, one year they may find that they owe the full boat, and we need to fix that. We've tried in the past, and in the legislatively, we've been stopped by the tax department. So really the governor, it's in his hands, he can address this. And that was the primary focus of our press conference. Of course, they started getting off on the topic of asking us how we felt about the issue with the governor. And being sensitive to the fact that we're of the opposite party, it really, our comments weren't partisan, and Democrats agree with us, many Democrats, but they kind of have a gag order and they're not comfortable talking about it. And I said, as Republicans, we are free to talk about our concerns. And I just found out today, we're talking about in the Rutland Herald has an article talking about 6 people, and it's not a partisan issue, but 6 different people came to the Attorney General's office, sent emails asking for an investigation of the governor. So people are concerned around the state.
Mm-hmm. Tim, before we leave this question, do you have a feeling that many residents, perhaps in your district, might fall under this sort of same situation where they perceive that they owe more in local property taxes than they actually would because their income is under a certain threshold?
I guess I'd like to address that a little differently than the question has been posed. Mm-hmm. I'm a justice of peace. And I know 2 justices of the peace who once a month go visit a woman in Weston and encourage her to pay down her delinquent tax. The Board of Abatement addressed her situation 2 or 3 years ago. The delinquent tax collector had referred her to the Board of Abatement. On the Board of Abatement, we abated as much as we felt we could under state law. And the reason that she'd had a balance, the reason she has the balance she has now, is because she didn't file those forms. Mm. Now, this is not a person that could comfortably read an HS 122, to say nothing of fill it out. And that's, I don't think that's particularly unusual. I think there are a lot of Vermonters that look at that form and their initial reaction is, oh my gosh, what's going on here?
Right.
And that's too complicated a system. So I've answered in terms of one specific situation, but there are probably others in Weston and certainly statewide. Weston's a pretty small sample.
Well, the case does raise questions not only about the Homestead Declaration and the complexities of Act 68, but I know one of the subjects that came up during the session that recently concluded was looking at education financing and possible reform of that. I know that's a perennial subject of discussion for a lot of folks ever since Act 68 passed in the early 2000s. But it seemed like you did spend a certain amount of time, because I think some folks were troubled by the 5 cent or so increase in the property tax that came in this past year. The prospect, as I understand it, of an even larger one next year, and that maybe it's finally beginning to force some discussion around whether or not the current system is still going to work as well as it should. You looked at small schools grants, maybe eliminating those, or a couple of other issues. And my understanding was that there's going to be some sort of a study about this over the course of the summer, and presumably be ready next January. But I guess I just wondered, do either of you see the prospect of there being any kind of real serious discussion of changing Act 68 or modifying it in some way, particularly considering that 2014 will be an election year, and this is a touchy subject, to put it mildly?
Well, in our committee, Ways and Means, and where Jeff Wilson also serves, there's a lot of conversation about this. We spent a lot of time. In the next room, right next door to us, is the Education Committee. And while we talk about ways to cut costs, Education Committee is coming up with all these great ideas that cost money. And there's a lot of frustration expressed. I'm new in that committee, but I guess this has been ongoing, and they talk about that frustration. And there were a lot of proposals put out there. They were rolled out, and they were pretty much shut down by the Senate, and actually probably by a lot of the people in the House as well. So I'm not optimistic about seeing any big changes coming about with regard. It's going to, yes, they're going to go up even more next year, but I don't think people have the stomach for making the cuts at the state level. They say I think it's the whole system that needs to be overhauled, because I think it's so complicated, and I've said this before many times, that the locals blame the state and the state blames the locals. I hear that happen all the time, and it's because it's a confusing system, and there's blame on both sides. And until we look at overhauling the whole system, we're not going to see great changes.
Is that your sense of things too, Tim, or?
It is. It is. The money has to come from somewhere, and nobody has come up with a reasonable alternative yet. And I think there are people on both sides of the aisle that don't like Act 60, Act 68 anymore. I'm not alone, I don't think, and I would imagine Patti joins me in thinking that this is a statute that it's going to keep rolling. It's going to work like a snowball rolling down a hill. It ain't ever going to get smaller. And it is going to take a rework of the whole works. Now there's a little thing that I want to try to do in the upcoming session, and I think it would probably have to go through Patti's committee, and that is that there are audit requirements for the schools. I've got one town in particular. When I explain that the annual audit costs them over $200,000, when I explain that to other legislators and other people, they say, "Well, I'd like that audit." Well, what they're speaking in terms of, there aren't very many students in this school. There are fewer than 50, and when you add a few $1,000 for an audit, that takes the cost per student and moves it up accordingly, and you spread that across the grand list, and you wind up with quite a lot of money.
So you think that they shouldn't have to do an audit every year?
I think the audit either hadn't ought to have to, or even better, toss it out of the education costs, because the towns are just collecting money for the state.
Right.
And the municipal budget and the local town school budget is not the problem with all. They're concerned because towns make the news every now and then because somebody acted as they should not have, and somebody discovers there's some money missing. Well, there wouldn't be all that money around if they weren't collecting it for the state in the first place, and that doesn't have very much to do with their education costs.
Right.
So I think there's some justification. I'm going to see if I can get anywhere with that.
Well, one of the other things that came up this past spring was pre-K education. It seemed to be an idea whose time seemed to have arrived. It almost seems like a contradiction, though. If we're talking about trying to save money in education, now we're going to add on pre-K requirement, basically, that all schools offer it. But it sounds like it wasn't really that much more money, or was I misunderstanding that?
It was going to, because right now, every town can offer pre-K. This was going to require, there are 39 towns that don't, that chose not to. It's 10 hours of pre-K per child and per week. And this would require these other towns to offer it. So the 39 towns, it would cost $1.2 million the first year, but within 4 years, it was estimated to cost $9.6 million per year increase. Wow. And what everybody sees is going on is they're starting with saying it's got to be minimum of 10 hours, and then what's going to happen in a few years, I didn't hear anybody who disagreed, is they're going to come and say, well, you really need to raise the requirement from 10 hours up to like 20 hours. We're losing students in the state. When I started in the legislature 9 years ago, we had 120,000 students K through 12. Now we have 85,000. So that's a remarkable, dramatic drop. Mm. This bumps up that number because Chrissy's pre-K kids are going to require to have teachers there. So I see this as also something to protect teachers. And that was what the real push was for, and because they're talking pre-K is 3- and 4-year-olds, not just 4-year-olds. And I had great concerns with the amount of money. And once this bill got to the Senate, they also had concerns, and it's sitting in the Senate now.
All right. Well, I guess we may hear more about that next year as well. Seem to have a lot of support behind the concept anyway.
Right. The concept is really good, but it's about what you can afford. And our outcomes on K through 12 are not great. I mean, we spend a lot of money in Vermont on our students, and the outcomes aren't measurable to the amount of money that we spend. It's something that people are well aware of. Another person is in education, Brian Campion from Bennington. He's doing a very, very good job about kind of holding people's feet to the fire about the outcomes and where the money is going. So, I've been very impressed with watching what he does.
Tim, one of the issues that the legislature did act on, and I know that you were interested in closely, was the question of the criminalization of marijuana. That was kind of a big deal, and what are your feelings about that? Do you think that was the right step for the legislature to take, or are there going to be potential pitfalls down the road?
I do feel that was the right step for the legislature to take. I'm well aware that you can speak with a lot of law enforcement officers and get some different input on that question. But right up front is the fact that we did not legalize marijuana.
There may be some misunderstandings around that.
We decriminalized it, but it's still, if you get caught with marijuana, it's going to cost you some money.
Now, is it basically like a traffic ticket? Is that the idea?
That's close. It's kind of an expensive. You'd have to be driving pretty fast, but but the fact of the matter is, nobody'd pay $200 or $300 to drink a beer.
Right. But basically, legally, I guess it is the equivalent of it.
Roughly. It is legally. And the thought there is, and some of this I think comes from a Chittenden County mode of thought, perhaps a little bit. I mean, you go up to Burlington, and how many colleges do you have? And you can't get some federal grants. Students can't get some federal grants if they happen to be a felon. And before decriminalization, they could wind up being a felon for the possession of marijuana. Now the fact is that in Burlington they probably wouldn't have. That would be more likely event in other parts of the state. The fines were pretty high, by the way, in Windham and Windsor counties, I noted. I gave my own son, I got an email from my son that gave the vote count in the Judiciary Committee and said, "What's up?" And I sent him back a message, and I said, "Now imagine that you're back at Champlain College, and you or a friend got caught in possession of marijuana. Would you rather be in Burlington or in Londonderry?" And he came back and said, "Burlington, you voted right."
All right.
Yeah, this was about making it consistent around the state, because that's what we were hearing. Up in north, they treated differently than in other counties, and it just didn't seem fair that depending on where you got caught, you were going to be treated differently.
Yeah, really. One of the other things that you folks passed now, before we leave that entirely, that bill comes into effect, what, next month? Is that,
Yes.
that the plan? Okay. That would be early July then. Okay, one of the other issues that I know was a very emotional issue for a lot of legislators was the death with dignity discussion. It eventually passed, but I know it was also a very, shall we say, well, I know your committee, for instance, wrestled with it for quite a while and really tried to kind of work through some of the potential problems. But eventually it did pass. I guess what were your reactions to it? Do you think that was the right decision to make, or?
I supported it a few years ago when it came up. Rick Hubie and I were the only two Republicans who supported it, and I kind of felt like he was with me this time around as well. I was happy to support the bill. It was much more dramatic what went on in the Senate. We passed it in the House, and but in the Senate they had so many different amendments and changing it back and forth, and there was a lot of things going on there. So I think the way it stands is for 3 years. There are all these hoops that you jump through if you choose this, and it's within 6 months of when you're diagnosed with a terminal illness, or you're diagnosed, within the 6 months of your death. You have to go through some steps in order to get approved, get this prescription that you may or may not take. After 3 years, what happens is it's between you and your doctor. Your doctor, just the two of you, and that's how it stands right now. And it just seemed an easy decision for me. I had heard something on the radio, and I mentioned it on the floor of the House. Somebody who supported this in Oregon, and it said, when people were on the top of the Trade Center on 9/11, and they were jumping off, and we all saw those horrible videos, were they committing suicide, or were they choosing a different way to die? And that's basically what I saw this bill being about. It's just choosing a different way to die.
Well, I had the pleasure, Tim, of sitting in on your committee one day and listening to the discussion. It was fascinating, really, to see all the potential situations that you folks were trying to work through, so that doctors wouldn't be in a morally or ethically complicated position. I hadn't really, I guess, appreciated the complexity of all of that until I was listening to the testimony you folks were hearing.
Yes, well, you got it right. And I was really pleased to listen to Dr. Till on the House floor. It was, a family practitioner.
He's a state representative, right? Who's the only, I guess, practicing doctor in the state house.
And he gave a breakdown of a survey that he'd done personally. I don't know that it would be an official survey, but he did it personally. And it was interesting where the doctors fell on that, because until then I had thought that there was a lot more opposition to it in the medical community than there is. And the fact of the matter is that the doctors that tended to be proponents of it are the doctors that are, maybe we could say, in the trenches. It's not the specialists. It's the people that are down dealing with the patients, and they are intimately aware of what goes on in the last few months of a situation where somebody's got a terminal illness that's causing a lot of pain. Those doctors tended to favor it. I've found, I know from my emails that religious beliefs are certainly a matter that influence people big time. But I think that that's the only bill that I actually received written communications from from individuals thanking me for my vote on, and I received correspondence before the vote from some people, some of whom I knew, some of whom I didn't, but they were elderly people in, their current situations, good health. But, they know what's going to be the next big event in their lives. And they'd like to probably be able to control it a little bit and make it something that's a little bit more to their liking than it might otherwise be. And I think they ought to have that right.
Okay. Well, one of the other subjects that came up, although I don't think you took action on it, was a bill about genetic modified food, the GMO bill. A couple of other states are also proceeding with some acts on this. I guess I just wondered, is this one of these bills that will come back next year, do you think, or are we finished with it again for a while?
I think did it pass the Senate?
I believe
it did not. No, yeah.
It passed the House.
It passed the House.
The Senate really hasn't. I don't think the Senate's really addressed it yet.
Yeah.
It will absolutely be a lawsuit, and people have concerns about Monsanto. And
why would there be a lawsuit? Just folks
it's
might not be familiar with it.
It's going to be challenged, and we know that everybody acknowledges that it will be challenged. What's going to happen is every item in the grocery store is going to have a label on it. Every single item that may contain. I mean, if it doesn't contain, and if they're not sure it contains GMOs, it'll have to have something tagged. So everything coming into the state is going to have to be labeled individually. And what I found out, what we heard from the floor of the House, is if something is organic, not all natural, but if it's organic, it already is GMO free. So you can go to your store and you can be comfortable that if you buy something that is organic, it does not contain GMOs. So we already have that. And people have their concerns with Monsanto, and I respect that, and I think we should have concerns, but this isn't the way, I don't believe this is the way to get at it. So I didn't support it. I think there are, again, people in the Senate that have similar concerns. They do know our Attorney General does not have a great success record of, when we do go to court, and I think they recognize this is going to cost us a lot of money.
Is that, where did you come down on this bill, Tim?
Patty and I are on the same page. There are certainly, that is a topic that I've received a few emails on, but Connecticut just passed a bill.
Right.
And it's interesting what Connecticut put at the end of their bill for when it would become effective. When 4 other northeastern states joined the fray, pass a bill, similar to the Connecticut bill, at least one of them has to border Connecticut.
Right, that makes sense.
And the 4 other states, not including Connecticut, have to have a together population of 20 million people. So Connecticut has passed the bill, but they've invited New York.
Right, I was going to say that's
or maybe Pennsylvania, but it's got to be either.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what I said. If it was a national, somebody did call me up about this, not happy with my vote, but when I explained it, they understood, because we do get a lot of emails on this, because I think this was sent out by an organization, and when they ask just to contact your legislators, they don't necessarily give all the facts. And I said, if this was a national law, yeah, I would support that. But as a state, we're not an island, and that's why Connecticut would send it like that. It's very difficult for these big, Post, and now I'm blanking out on some big food distributors, Kraft, to just section out Vermont. Now, when they deliver to Vermont, they're going to have these labels on everything. It makes it very difficult.
Well, to be continued, I guess, eh? We'll have to have you both back again, perhaps in the fall or before the start of the session. It seems like only yesterday that the 4 of you, Jeff Wilson, Cynthia Browning, and the 2 of you were here, and we were talking about what was going to happen in the 2013 legislature. We were happy to have Cynthia Browning and Jeff Wilson on a couple of weeks ago to talk about their perspectives on it. So good that we were able to get everyone back in and their look at how things turned out in the end.
Can I just give a plug for income sensitivity? Filling out homestead declarations if you are income sensitized, or if you're not sure, check with check with the tax department, but fill out your homestead declaration forms properly. There's 3 forms. Fill them all out so that you can get your prebate.
All right. Well, there you go. Well, thank you, Tim and Patti Komline, for being with us today and talking a little bit about what the state legislature did this past year. And thank all of you for watching. This has been the Front Page on GNAT TV. My name is Andrew McKeever, the managing editor of the Manchester Journal. Have a good day. We've resisted the temptation to weigh in with a comment or two about Governor Peter Shumlin's unfortunate property acquisition in East Montpelier so far, and it hasn't been easy. Rarely do situations come along that offer the richness of this one, the state's most powerful official stumbling over such an avoidable pitfall as he has with an indigent neighbor who clearly had no business negotiating the sale of his home and property without some outside legal counsel, and the inevitable appearance that the governor exploited the situation to his personal benefit. Or maybe the facts just haven't fully come out yet. We'll see. But even allowing for that, it's remarkable that someone with the governor's political antenna and acumen didn't see the warning flags not only fluttering, but stretched out full in front of him. To recap, for those of you who have been busy with other things these past few weeks, last fall, Governor Peter Shumlin negotiated the purchase of a parcel of property adjacent to the one he already owned in East Montpelier. That parcel was assessed for more than $233,000 and was owned by a man named Jeremy Dodge, who had a long record of petty crime and who clearly suffered from some learning disabilities. Shumlin urged Dodge to get his own lawyer to help him with the transaction, but Dodge didn't. Facing the prospect, Dodge believed, of losing his home and property entirely to a tax sale because he owed about $18,000 in back taxes to East Montpelier, he decided to sell the 16-acre property to Shumlin for $58,000, a fraction of its apparent worth. Town listers have since reduced the assessed value of the property to $140,000 due to the distressed condition of the house that's on the property. Now Dodge says he regrets the deal, and says he didn't understand that there were other alternatives he might have explored to avoid eviction and the property being put up for a tax sale. Shumlin, to his credit, sort of, has offered to sell the property back to his neighbor for the same price he paid for it, assuming a payment schedule can be worked out. So that's where things stood as of last weekend anyway. We'll offer the governor some free political advice. There's no way he comes out looking like any kind of good guy here unless he forgoes the entire deal and resets the dials to where they stood before this whole sorry misadventure began. Tear up whatever contracts have been signed, no matter if they are legal and were entered into fair and square. Then offer to pay Jeremy Dodge the full fair market value for his property if the governor wants it that badly. The governor is a wealthy man. He can afford it. Jeremy Dodge, the indigent neighbor, needs top dollar for his land. The smart thing to do politically, and the right thing morally, is for the governor to pony up if Dodge's parcel of land is that valuable to him. All that is, however, secondary to the main point that we see coming out of this whole political tar baby. As former state representative Oliver Olson, who once represented the district of Weston, Windhall, Stratton, Jamaica, and Londonderry from 2010 to 2012, noted shortly after the news of this whole deal broke a couple of weeks ago, Dodge should never have had to pay that much in taxes owing to his low annual income. The income sensitivity provisions of Act 68, the educational financing law in the state, are supposed to protect citizens like Jeremy Dodge, who own property that's assessed and of taxable value that far outstrips their ability to pay because their income is below a certain figure. While we've expressed concerns from time to time whether or not those income sensitivity provisions have shielded homeowners from fully appreciating the connection between their education taxes and property values, in this case, Mr. Dodge should have not been untroubled by the $18,000 he owed, he thought, in back taxes, because his annual income apparently, according to news reports, is in the $10,000 or so range, and that's too low. However, he failed to file the appropriate paperwork, in this case, a homestead declaration. Jeremy Dodge is not alone in having trouble understanding the complexities of Act 68 and the requirement of filing a homestead declaration. Our best guess is that many Vermonters don't either, including many who finished high school and college, hold good-paying jobs, and are otherwise consider themselves to be active, functioning members of society. The law is simply too complex, as we've said before. Many others have said the same thing. If put to the test, probably few lawmakers could offer up a succinct explanation of Act 68. Patti Komline, another local state representative from Dorset, has addressed this issue at a recent press conference where she both castigated the governor for taking advantage of a handicapped neighbor and called for a more streamlined approach to income sensitivity. She and her legislative colleague Kurt Wright, Republican of Burlington, would also like to see each town clerk pull up lists of residents who are in danger of having their properties auctioned off at a public tax sale to see if they could avoid all that simply by reviewing whether or not they qualify for relief because of their income status. Interestingly enough, Governor Shumlin thinks simplifying that process is a good idea too. Now, as one of the prime architects of the original Act 60 legislation, which paved the way for its successor, Act 68, it's surprising that this hadn't occurred to him before. It would also be surprising if he didn't think to suggest to Jeremy Dodge that he should explore whether or not he was in fact on the hook for the $18,000 in back taxes that listers in East Montpelier said he owed. The governor is a shrewd bargainer with a business background and is not intimidated or daunted by paperwork. Most ordinary folks find it burdensome, at the very least, as well as confusing, at the worst. Again, while we don't expect to be hired as political spin doctors by the governor's office anytime soon, we'd suggest to Mr. Shumlin that now is a good time to cut his losses, go back to square one, and void the deal outright. The governor did nothing wrong in a legal sense, and no one is suggesting that he broke any laws or anything like that. But he did take advantage of a situation that just comes off looking a little unseemly for the state's top elected public official. It's not like the governor is another business guy out making a deal. You give up something when you aspire to and obtain high public office, and with the benefits of that come some limitations as well. This is one example of that. Thank you.